Welcome to week 4. Had a great week 3 with some really rich conversation. So far, we actually have a couple of video discussion groups coming tomorrow, Tuesday, as I'm recording this on Monday. And I'm inspired, I think, by what I see you all learning from the study of the New Testament so far, especially with this kind of introduction to narrative as the way that the kind of life of Jesus is given to us. So thankful for those discussions and looking forward to seeing them grow over the next several weeks. We are coming this next week to what is probably aptly described as the heart of our faith. It's the study of the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And I have put this study at this point in the course because I am hoping that you are going to be able to gain a lot of insight into it after growing in your understanding of how narratives work in the first part of the course, because the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus come to us primarily in the New Testament as the culmination of a whole story of Jesus's life, of who Jesus is. And that's not often how we have treated or engaged or even remembered the death and resurrection of Jesus. So often the death and resurrection of Jesus, to say nothing of the ascension, which is mostly forgotten, but the death and resurrection of Jesus are reduced to kind of these naked elements in a formula. So that when we say Jesus died for our sins, there isn't a lot of content to who Jesus was who died, how it is that he died, what led to his death, what gave his death the meaning, the power that it had, so that we can say about it that he died for our sins. And what are sins such that they require a death, or that they can be addressed by a death of Jesus? So hopefully you're beginning to see that we have certain kind of basic formulations in Christian faith that in many cases have really lost their bodily reality. They've lost the content that comes from their place in the story of who Jesus was and who Jesus is. So one of my big hopes for this week is that as you're studying the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, you will grow in your sense of what they mean by virtue of being able to hear them, digest them as the culmination of the gospel story as it comes to us through 4 distinct narratives. Now, I also want to use this intro video to give you a brief sense of the next formal assignment that is coming over the next couple weeks in our class. You've finished your book review of The Shadow of the Galilean, and now we are moving on to our first interpretive working paper of the class. Now, there's a description of this assignment in the syllabus. There's a guide for how to do the assignment that's included in this week's material. There are sample papers for you to consult to get a sense of what good assignments, good papers that are interpretive working papers have been in the past. I really encourage you to study these materials really carefully. The instructions for the assignment, the sample papers, it will go a long way towards helping you be successful yourself in writing your first interpretive working paper for the class. Now, broadly, what is an interpretive working paper? It is an investigation, a study of a particular passage. I've given you 5 options from which to choose in the syllabus, so you need to choose one of those 5. And the operative term, perhaps, is that it is a working paper. So it's a study that is trying to develop an interpretation of a particular passage, but it's a study that is still at the working phase. And that, I think, is appropriate for this course, which is an introduction to the New Testament. It means that you're not expected in this paper to produce a polished, conclusive argument defending a particular interpretation of the passage. I think that's something for an advanced level that will come further on in your studies at Fuller, or if not, perhaps beyond Fuller if you're nearing the end of your studies. In this case, I want you to have the room in a paper to be able to consider multiple possibilities for what the passage means, to ask questions of the passage. That's a really important dimension of this paper, and not necessarily to feel the pressure to arrive at a bunch of hard and fast conclusions. So this paper does not require that you have an introduction or a conclusion or a thesis guiding your paper. Instead, it is a study of the passage that works at analyzing it by focusing on particular issues for interpreting the passage. And what issues you identify is up to you, although the assignment guide gives you some suggestions, because the issues that you study should be a function of your own investigation of the passage. The kinds of issues that you'll often be addressing are how this passage that you're studying fits into the larger flow of the narrative, and what influence that has on what it means, what certain parts of the passage mean. Another issue might be how to relate sort of different parts of the passage, how they connect to one another so that you can make sense of the development of the passage. There might just be a part of the passage that's really puzzling, something that Jesus says. And so you might devote a section of your paper to trying to analyze that saying of Jesus's in the context of the passage, in the context of the larger narrative, and teasing out some possible interpretations of that puzzling word from Jesus. So hopefully you get the idea. You can't cover everything in this paper, but you do need to show that you are developing sort of sound judgment, some skill in identifying what the most weighty issues might be in the interpretation of a passage. Sometimes it's tempting to just investigate anything that occurs to you, or to ask questions about just anything in the passage. And the problem with that is that sometimes it doesn't lead really to any clarification of what the passage means. So you want to be asking questions strategically so that you're beginning to sort of arrive at some clarification of what the passage means, even as it remains, as I've said, a working paper. I'm happy to field further questions from you if you want to ask those in the general questions forum that we have available in the class. But I trust that the conversations that we've had thus far, the prompts that I've given you, and the engagement in the forum discussions will have prepared you, kind of acquainted you with the kinds of skill that this paper asks you to show and to further develop. So you can also look to the study that we've done thus far in the first 3 weeks of the class to get a sense of what this paper is asking of you. The best way, of course, to be really clear about what the assignment expects of you is to read the assignment guide carefully, have that open in front of you as you're doing the assignment, and to study a good number of sample papers that show you kind of an example of how to do this paper well. So with that, hopefully you have a good sense of what is coming in terms of the assignment. Logistically, the way that you're going to submit this assignment is simply to paste the text of your paper that you compose on your computer in a Word file or something onto a Google Doc that is linked in the summary of the work for the week, the material that we have for the week. So there's a Google Doc that has your name. That will be your document for this assignment. And once you've finished composing your first complete draft of it this week and submitting that by the end of week 4, then next week in week 5, we'll be going through a peer review process of that paper. And you don't need to worry about that yet. I'll give you instructions for that when we get there. This week, I just want you to focus on writing your first complete draft of the paper and getting that on your Google Doc by the end of week 4. Holy Week is a recent memory for us and in a demanding time of our lives. And so I hope that our study of the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus will be enriching to you because of the recent celebration of it as Christian communities, but also for perhaps the way it might speak to us in this moment in which we find ourselves. Because what we're going to find in this climax of the gospel story is that Jesus decides not to refuse the difficulty, the judgment, the consequences for injustice that are coming to his generation, that are coming to his people, that are coming to his land, but instead to face those with his eyes open and to be in solidarity with the pain and the loss and even the injustice of his community. And it's precisely that fierce resolve to love his people, to love his neighbor, to love even his enemy, all the way to the end, that makes him an enemy himself, a threat, a target for execution in public shame, and at the same time makes that way of dying so powerful that it transforms the entire world, that it leads to the beginning of the resurrection from among the dead and the spread of a life of power, not for escaping death, not for escaping disease, not for escaping mental illness or the estrangements that characterize our life, but instead power to face precisely those burdens and to do so with hope, to do so with mercy, and therefore to convey healing. That is, in a nutshell, the power of Jesus's death that leads to his resurrection and then his exaltation to be the name that is above every name. So that's what we'll be studying this week, and I hope that you'll find inspiration in it for God's call on your life in this very time in which we're living, as well as for the seasons that are still coming in our future. So God bless your study this week.